The shot was a hollow crack against the oppressive silence of the Redemption High Street. Dust, stirred by a lazy midday wind, hung in the air, like a shroud tasting of grit and sun-baked earth. Inside the First Territorial Bank, the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, stale sweat and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Elias Vance lay pressed against the polished mahogany of the teller's counter, the splintered wood digging into his cheek. He was a rancher now. He told himself that every morning when the sun crested the jagged peaks overlooking Pine Creek Ranch. He was a man of soil and seasons, not of steel and split-second decisions. But the muscle memory was a stubborn ghost. His hand calloused from leather reins, and fence wire twitched for the Colt Peacemaker that no longer sat on his hip. He had traded it for peace, a peace that had just been shattered. Nobody moves. The voice was raw, frayed with desperation. A young man barely old enough to shave waved a Navy revolver with a shaking hand. His two companions, older and harder, were stuffing canvas bags with currency, their movements practiced and swift. Elias kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. He catalogued the details automatically: 3 robbers, 2 with rifles, 1 with a pistol. At least a dozen hostages, women, children, old man Abernathy from the general store. The odds were poor. The chances of this ending without bloodshed were poorer still. He could feel the familiar cold dread coiling in his gut, the same feeling that had haunted his sleep for 5 long years. "Don't get involved," a voice in his head commanded. It was the voice of survival, the voice that had kept him sane in his self-imposed exile. "You're not that man anymore." But then a woman near the door began to sob, a high, panicked sound that cut through the tension like a knife. The young robber spun toward her, his eyes wide with animal terror. "Shut her up," I said, "shut up." Elias saw the boy's finger tighten on the trigger. He saw the barrel of the gun waver, pointing indiscriminately into the cluster of terrified townsfolk. And he saw Elizabeth. Just for a second, he saw his wife's face in the crowd, her eyes pleading with him the same way they had in that blood-soaked room when he had failed her so completely. The memory was a physical blow. The world narrowed to that single wavering gun. He couldn't let it happen again. He couldn't stand by while his failure to act cost another innocent life. He moved. It wasn't a choice, but an instinct he had tried to bury for half a decade. He surged to his feet in one fluid motion, grabbing the heavy brass inkwell from the counter. "Hey!" he roared, his voice a gravelly command that ripped through the bank. The young robber's head snapped toward him. Elias hurled the inkwell. It flew true, a dark projectile that struck the boy's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. The revolver clattered to the floor. As the other 2 robbers turned momentarily stunned, Elias vaulted over the counter. He slammed into the nearest man, driving him back against the wall. The rifle discharged the bullet, plowing harmlessly into the ceiling, raining plaster dust down on them. The 3rd robber leveled his rifle, but it was too late. Sheriff Brody and his deputy burst through the doors, shotguns booming. The fight was over almost before it began, in the ensuing chaos of screams, shouts, and crying. Elias slipped back into the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt exposed, stripped bare. The rancher's facade had crumbled, and the U.S. Marshal he once was stood revealed. He hated it. He hated the adrenaline, the cold clarity, the memory of what it felt like to hold a life in his hands. He was pushing his way toward the exit when a stray sound made him freeze. It was the sharp tinkle of shattering glass. Across the street, a bullet, likely from the rifle he'd knocked aside, had punched a hole through the window of the land office. It was a clean, perfect circle. And through that circle, as if framed for his eyes, only he could see the large, meticulously drawn deed map of the county. The bullet hole was centered directly over a parcel of land, marked in bold ink, Pine Creek Ranch. Elias Vance, proprietor. A cold dread deeper than the fear of the robbery settled over him. It was a message. a coincidence too perfect to be ignored. As the townsfolk spilled onto the street dazed and relieved, Elias noticed something glinting on the dusty floorboards near the entrance. He bent down and picked it up. It was a small silver locket, its chain broken. It must have been dropped by one of the hostages in the panic. He thumbed it open. Inside was a faded portrait of a young woman with a gentle smile, and a space for another, which was empty. The image was a phantom pain. He closed the locket, the cool metal pressing into his palm. It felt like a brand, a reminder of the life he'd lost, the family he'd failed to protect. He slipped it into his pocket, a stolen piece of someone else's past that now felt inextricably tangled with his own. He needed to get back to the ranch, back to the silence, back to the pretense that he was just a man who worked the land and not a ghost haunted by the dead. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, and the red dust of the plains settled like a fine powder on every surface. A constant reminder of the unforgiving landscape that separated redemption from the rest of the world. Elias rode hard, the rhythmic beat of his horse's hooves a counterpoint to the frantic pounding in his own chest. Pine Creek Ranch wasn't just land. It was his penance, his sanctuary. The bullet hole in the land office window felt like a violation, a threat aimed at the one place he had left to call home. His property sat nestled in a high valley, a green slash of life against the ochre and rust of the surrounding bluffs. A clear, cold creek, the ranch's lifeblood, carved its way through the meadow, nourishing the cottonwoods and pines that gave the place its name. He had built the cabin himself, felling the timber and setting the stones with his own 2 hands. It was a solid, lonely structure that mirrored the man who lived within it. Dismounting in the yard, he felt the silence of the valley settle over him. It was a profound quiet, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk. This was the peace he had paid for with his past, and he guarded it fiercely. Inside the cabin was sparse and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a simple table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and a single bed was tucked into a corner. On a small hand-carved shelf sat his only connection to the man he used to be, a row of worn medical textbooks. He ran a hand over their leather spines, the ghost of a different life rising to meet him. Before he was a marshal, he had been a doctor, a healer, a title that now felt like a bitter mockery. He sank onto a chair at the table and pulled the silver locket from his pocket. He opened it again, staring at the smiling woman. She was a stranger, yet her loss felt intimate. He knew what it was to carry a memory like this, a face etched behind your eyelids, a voice you could almost hear on the wind. He thought of Elizabeth's locket, the one he had buried with her, its twin resting in a locked box beneath his bed. He had failed to save her, and in doing so had destroyed himself. The guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to him even in the brightest sunlight. His isolation was threatened by more than just memories. For the past 6 months, Judge Thaddeus Sterling had been trying to drive him off his land. Sterling was the most powerful man in the county, a man whose influence was woven into the very fabric of redemption. He owned the bank, held the mortgages on half the businesses, and dispensed justice from his courtroom with an air of divine authority. He wanted Pine Creek Ranch, and he was a man who always got what he wanted. The judge's first offers had been polite, delivered by a well-dressed lawyer from the city. When Elias refused, the offers became demands. When he ignored the demands, the threats began. Fences were cut. A prize bull went missing. His application for a water rights extension was mysteriously and indefinitely delayed. Now the bullet. It felt like an escalation, a final warning. Elias walked to the window and looked out at his land. The creek sparkled, the pines stood like silent sentinels, and the mountains rose against the vast blue sky. This place was his last stand. It was where he had come to forget, and where he would be forced to remember. He put the stranger's locket on the table, a small silver token of the violence he had tried to escape. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the world was coming for him. And this time, he wasn't sure he had the strength to fight back. 3 days later, the stagecoach from the east arrived kicking up a plume of dust that was visible for miles. It brought with it the mail supplies, and on this occasion, a passenger who would irrevocably alter the course of Elias's solitary existence. Her name was Eleanora Hastings, though she preferred Nora. She stepped down from the coach, her traveling suit, a sensible gray wool, impeccably tailored, looking profoundly out of place against the raw, unfinished backdrop of redemption. She was a creature of Boston, of brick sidewalks and gas lamps, of libraries and lecture halls. Here she felt like a page from a misplaced book. She carried with her a single heavy trunk and a letter of introduction from Judge Sterling. The letter, which she had read a dozen times on the journey, outlined the terms of her arrangement. She was to be the mail-order bride of a Mr. Elias Vance, a reclusive rancher. Her true purpose, however, was far more insidious. "Your role, Miss Hastings," Judge Sterling had explained in his opulent book-lined study back east, his voice a silken web of persuasion, "is to be my eyes and ears. Mr. Vance is a stubborn man, illegally occupying land that is vital to the territory's future. He is unstable, a fallen man haunted by a tragic past. I need you to observe him, to learn his weaknesses, to discover what leverage might be required to persuade him to relinquish his claim." The judge had painted a picture of a broken, brutish hermit. He had hinted at a dark history, a fall from grace that had left Vance a shell of a man. Her mission, Sterling had assured her, was a noble one, a service to the cause of progress. He had paid her a sum that would ensure her father's medical bills were settled and her family's security guaranteed for years. It was a devil's bargain, and Nora had accepted it with the grim pragmatism of a woman with no other choice. As she stood on the dusty street, waiting for the man who was to be her husband and her target, she clutched her satchel, the judge's words echoing in her mind. "He is a man of secrets, Miss Hastings. Uncover them." Sheriff Brody approached her, tipping his hat. "You must be Miss Hastings. Vance is waiting for you over at the livery." He gestured with his thumb. "Just be warned, ma'am. He's not much for company." Nora found Elias Vance loading supplies into a buckboard wagon. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his simple flannel shirt. When he turned, she was struck by his face. It was not the face of the brute she had imagined. It was a landscape of harsh lines and quiet sorrow, his features sharp as if carved from granite. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, were what held her. They were watchful, intelligent, and held a weariness that seemed ancient. "Mr. Vance," she asked, her voice more formal than she intended. He straightened, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her city clothes, her posture, the undisguised apprehension on her face. He said nothing for a long moment. His silence was not empty. It was heavy-weighted with unspoken questions. "I am Eleanora Hastings," she continued, filling the void. "Judge Sterling arranged for my passage." Elias's jaw tightened at the mention of the judge's name. "I'm aware." His voice was a low rasp, a sound like stones grinding together. He made no move to help with her trunk, simply nodding toward the wagon. "Put your things in the back. It's a long ride." The journey to Pine Creek Ranch was conducted in a taut silence. Nora sat ramrod straight on the hard wagon seat, acutely aware of the chasm of space between them. The landscape was brutal and beautiful, a panorama of raw elemental power that both intimidated and fascinated her. She tried to make conversation, once commenting on the stark beauty of the Red Rock canyons. Elias's only reply was a non-committal grunt. He was a man of few words, and it seemed he had already spent his allotment for the day. He was a fortress, and she was the spy sent to breach its walls. Looking at his stern, unreadable profile, She felt a sliver of doubt. The man Judge Sterling had described was a broken wreck. This man felt like something else, entirely a formidable guarded force, dangerous in his stillness. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Nora's surprise was palpable. She had expected a crude shack, a hovel befitting a hermit. Instead, she saw a solid log home, well-built and sturdy with a stone chimney, sending a curl of welcoming smoke into the clear mountain air. A well-tended vegetable garden sat beside the cabin, and split-rail fences marked the boundaries of a neat, orderly homestead. Elias brought the wagon to a halt and jumped down. "There are 2 rooms," he said, his tone flat and impersonal, as he unloaded her trunk. "The one on the east is yours. It gets the morning sun." He carried her trunk inside and set it at the foot of a simple but well-made bed. The room was small, but clean and bright. A handmade quilt lay folded on the mattress, and a pitcher and basin sat on a small washstand filled with fresh water. Through the window, she could see the creek sparkling in the afternoon light. "The arrangement is simple," Elias said, pausing at the doorway, his large frame filling the space. "You will have your own room, your own privacy. You will be expected to cook and keep the house. In return, you will have food and shelter. This is a business transaction. Nothing more." He turned to leave, then hesitated. "One more thing. Whatever the judge told you about me, I'd advise you to forget it. He's a man who deals in lies." With that, he was gone, leaving Nora alone in the quiet room. She sank onto the bed, the silence of the valley pressing in on her. This was not what she had expected. The man was not the brute from Sterling's stories. The home was not a hovel. She looked around the small, clean room, a space he had prepared for her, and felt a profound and unsettling sense of conflict. Her mission was to betray this man, to find the cracks in his armor and report them back to his enemy. But as she listened to the quiet sounds of him moving about the main room, the steady, rhythmic chop of him splitting firewood, she wondered if the man who truly dealt in lies was not the silent rancher, but the eloquent judge who had sent her here. The first week at Pine Creek Ranch was a lesson in strained civility. Elias and Nora moved around each other like 2 wary animals forced to share a den. Their conversations were clipped and functional, limited to the necessities of running the homestead. "The stove needs wood. Supper is ready. I'll be checking the north fence line today." Nora found herself watching him, constantly searching for the weaknesses Judge Sterling had spoken of. But Elias Vance was a man of relentless competence. He worked from sunup to sundown with a quiet, focused intensity that was both admirable and intimidating. He mended fences, tended his small herd of cattle, and worked his garden with a methodical skill that suggested a deep connection to the land. There were no signs of the broken, unstable man she had been sent to uncover. Her first real glimpse behind his formidable walls came one blistering afternoon. The creek, their only source of water, had dwindled to a sluggish trickle. The spring that feeds it is high up in the canyon. Elias said, his brow furrowed as he stared at the nearly dry creek bed. Something must be blocking it. The trek up the canyon was arduous. The sun beat down, and the air was thin and hot. Nora, despite her practical boots and split skirt, struggled to keep pace with Elias's long, relentless strides. She prided herself on her resilience, but the raw physicality of this land was humbling. They found the source of the problem a mile upstream. A rock slide had dammed the narrow channel where the spring emerged from the canyon wall, diverting the water into a sinkhole. A massive boulder the size of a carriage blocked the main flow. "It's too big to move," Nora said, stating the obvious. Elias didn't reply. He was already studying the rock slide, his gray eyes calculating angles and stress points. He circled the boulder, running his hands over its surface, testing smaller rocks for leverage. For an hour, he worked in the brutal heat, using a long, sturdy pine limb as a lever, his muscles straining, sweat soaking his shirt. He was a force of nature, pitting his will against the unyielding stone. Nora found herself handing him smaller rocks to use as fulcrums, fetching him water, her initial role as an observer, forgotten in the urgency of the task. She saw a raw determination in him, a refusal to be beaten, that Sterling had never mentioned. Finally, with a great groaning sound, the boulder shifted. Water freed from its prison, surged past the obstruction, a muddy torrent that quickly cleared, rushing down the canyon toward the thirsty ranch. Elias leaned against the canyon wall, breathing heavily, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than guarded neutrality in his eyes. It was a flicker of acknowledgement, a shared moment of triumph. "Thank you," he said, the words startling in their sincerity. "I didn't do much." Nora replied, surprised by her own breathlessness. "You stayed," he said simply. The walk back to the cabin was different. The silence was no longer strained, but comfortable. A reluctant respect had been forged between them in the heat and dust of the canyon. That evening, as Nora prepared supper, she found Elias watching her. "You're educated," he stated, his tone one of observation rather than judgment. "Your speech, the way you carry yourself." "I was a student at Radcliffe College before my father's illness required me to return home," she answered truthfully. He nodded slowly, absorbing this information. "This is no place for a college woman." "Perhaps not," Nora said, meeting his gaze. "But it is the place I find myself." Their fragile truce was tested a few nights later. Nora was jolted from sleep by a sound from the main room. It was a choked, desperate cry, followed by a torrent of muttered words. She crept to her door and peered through the crack. Elias was in the grip of a nightmare. He was thrashing in his bed, his face contorted in agony. "I can't stop the bleeding," he gasped, his voice thick with anguish. "Elizabeth, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Nora's blood ran cold. Elizabeth. The name from his nightmare. The name of the woman who haunted him. She watched frozen as he fought his invisible demons. This was it. This was the weakness Sterling had told her about, the tragic past that had broken him. She should have felt a sense of victory, of a mission accomplished. Instead, she felt a profound and unwelcome wave of compassion. The next morning, Elias was more withdrawn than ever, his face a grim mask. He didn't mention the nightmare, and Nora didn't dare to. But the knowledge of his secret grief lay between them, a shared secret that Nora felt a strange and powerful duty to protect. Her search for his secrets led her to a small, secluded grove of aspen trees behind the cabin. There, tucked away from the main path, was a simple wooden cross marking a single well-tended grave. The name carved into the wood was faint but legible: Elizabeth Vance, beloved wife. Nora knelt before the grave, a lump forming in her throat. He came here often. The ground was clear of weeds, and a small faded bundle of dried wildflowers lay at the base of the cross. This was not the act of a brute. This was the quiet, enduring grief of a man who had loved and lost. Later that week, while searching for clean linens, she discovered a locked wooden box beneath his bed. Her heart pounded. This was what she was here for. After a moment of hesitation, her duty to the judge warring with her growing respect for Elias, she found the key hidden in one of his medical books. Inside the box, she did not find damning evidence of his instability. Instead, she found a life packed away in memories. There was a tintype photograph of a smiling young woman, Elizabeth, her arm linked with a younger, happier Elias. There were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, a pressed flower, and a silver locket, the twin to the one she had seen him bury with his wife. And beneath it all, a folded, official-looking document. It was his commission as a U.S. Marshal. Nora sank back on her heels, the contents of the box spread before her. A decorated marshal, a loving husband, a trained doctor. This was the man Judge Sterling had called a broken hermit. The lies were piling up, and Nora was beginning to feel buried beneath them. Her allegiance was shifting slowly, but irrevocably. She had come to Pine Creek to uncover the secrets of Elias Vance. Instead, she was beginning to feel that the real secret was the depth of Judge Sterling's deception. She started to see the attacks on the ranch not as the actions of a desperate man, but as the calculated cruelty of a powerful enemy. When a section of their fence was cut for the third time, scattering their cattle, she saw the cold hand of the judge at work. When their winter supplies left at the depot in town were accidentally ruined, she knew it was sabotage. She and Elias worked together to round up the cattle. Their movements synchronized, their words few but effective. They rode for hours, a silent team united against an unseen enemy. As they drove the last of the herd back toward the ranch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the valley, a rider appeared on the ridge above them. He was silhouetted against the fiery sky, a lone figure watching them. He held his position for a long moment, then wheeled his horse around and disappeared. Sterling's man Elias set his voice flat. He likes to watch. It was then that Nora knew her mission had changed. She was no longer a spy. She was a guardian. She had been sent to destroy this man, but instead she found herself wanting to protect him, to stand with him against the powerful, ruthless man who sought to ruin him. The letter arrived by courier, a man who rode a horse branded with Judge Sterling's insignia. He handed the sealed envelope to Nora with a knowing smirk, as if they were co-conspirators. "From the judge," he said. "He expects a prompt reply." Nora's hands trembled as she took it. She waited until the rider had disappeared down the trail before breaking the wax seal. She had been dreading this. For weeks she had delayed writing to Sterling, crafting vague, non-committal reports that said nothing of substance. She knew her time was running out, and was. She read the letter in the privacy of her room, her stomach twisting into a tight knot. "Miss Hastings, your reports have been inadequate. I require specifics. Details of Mr. Vance's mental state, his habits, his vulnerabilities. You were sent to do a job, not to enjoy the rustic scenery. My patience is not infinite. There is a matter of some urgency. A new survey has revealed significant silver deposits running through the Pine Creek Valley. The railroad has expressed interest. Vance's sentimentality can no longer be allowed to stand in the way of progress. I need a reason to have him removed officially and legally. Find me one. Do not fail me. Remember our arrangement and the consequences should you choose to renege on it. Respectfully, Judge T. Sterling." The letter was a cold slap of reality. Silver. The railroad. It had never been about progress. It was about greed. Sterling's noble cause was a lie spun to conceal his avarice. Nora crumpled the letter in her fist, a surge of defiant anger rising within her. She had to tell Elias. The thought was terrifying. It would mean confessing her own deception, admitting that she had entered his home under false pretenses. He would hate her, and she knew with a certainty that ached in her chest that she could not bear his hatred. She had come to care for this quiet, wounded man. His sparse words had become meaningful, his rare smiles precious. The shared work, the silent companionship, the slow, cautious building of trust, it had all woven itself into the fabric of her life. To tear it now seemed unthinkable. She found him in the barn, mending a saddle, his large hands surprisingly deft, with the needle and all. The scent of leather and hay hung in the air, a scent she had come to associate with him, with a sense of safety and stability she hadn't realized she was missing. "Elias." She began, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to tell you something." He looked up, his gray eyes, immediately sensing her distress. He set down his tools and gave her his full attention. Before she could confess, a noise from outside caught their attention. It was the sound of approaching riders, too many for a friendly visit. Elias moved to the barn door, his body instantly tense. Nora followed, peering around him. A half-dozen men led by Sterling's brutish foreman, Jed, were riding into their yard. Vance Jed called out, his voice a belligerent shout. "The judge wants a word." "The judge knows where I live," Elias replied evenly, his voice dangerously quiet. "He sent us to deliver the message," Jed sneered. He dismounted, and his men fanned out their hands, resting on their sidearms. "The offer on this land has expired. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. After that, we'll be back to remove you. By force if necessary." "This is my land," Elias said, his jaw tight. "I have the deed." "Deeds can get lost," Jed said with a cruel smile. "Just like people." As the men turned to leave, Nora noticed one of them dropping a small weighted parcel near the well. It was a subtle, almost careless movement. After they had ridden away, Elias walked over and picked it up. He unwrapped the oilcloth to reveal a dead rattlesnake, its fangs bared. It was a final chilling warning. That night, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. The unspoken confession hung between them, heavier than the threat of Jed and his men. Nora knew she couldn't wait any longer. She found Elias by the fireplace, cleaning his rifle, a weapon she had never seen him touch before. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the grim set of his jaw. "They'll kill you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "They'll try," he replied, not looking up. "Elias, I was sent here by Judge Sterling." The confession tumbled out in a rush of shame and fear. "He hired me to be his spy. He wanted me to find a weakness, a reason to have you declared incompetent so he could take your land. He told me you were a broken man, a danger to yourself." Elias stopped cleaning the rifle. He slowly raised his head, and the look in his eyes was one she would never forget. It was not anger, not yet. It was a profound, shattering disappointment, a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical blow. The trust they had so carefully built lay in ruins at their feet. Everything he said was a lie. She pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I saw your competence, your integrity. I saw your grief for your wife. I found her grave, Elias. I know you're a good man." He stood up, his towering frame seeming to shrink the room. The silence stretched each second an eternity. "Why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Because I couldn't let him do this to you. I couldn't be a part of it. I chose a side, Elias. I choose you." She held out the crumpled letter from Sterling. "He wants the silver on your land. He was never going to let you stay." He took the letter, but didn't read it. His gaze was fixed on her face, searching for the truth. Nora held his gaze, her heart breaking, willing him to believe her. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night, the frantic clucking and squawking of the chickens. Elias moved to the window, rifle in hand. In the moonlight, Nora could see a dark shape moving near the chicken coop. A flicker of orange blossomed in the darkness, and the scent of smoke began to drift toward the cabin. "They didn't wait 48 hours, Elias said grimly. "They're trying to burn us out." He shoved the rifle into her hands. "Do you know how to use this?" Nora, whose only experience with firearms was at a polite shooting gallery in Boston, shook her head, her hands trembling. "Then learn," he said, his voice hard as steel. He grabbed a shotgun from above the mantel and a box of shells. "Stay here, bar the door. Shoot anything that tries to get through it." And with that, he was gone, melting into the night to defend the home she had been sent to destroy. Nora was left alone, the heavy rifle in her hands, and the smell of smoke in the air, and the terrible weight of her betrayal settling over her like a shroud. The fire at the chicken coop was a diversion. Elias knew it the moment he saw the flames. Sterling's men weren't clumsy, they were cruel and methodical. This was meant to draw him out, to separate him from the cabin and from Nora. He circled wide, moving through the darkness, with the silent grace of a predator, the shotgun held ready. From the shadows of the pines he saw them. 3 men creeping toward the back of the cabin, their intentions clear. He raised the shotgun, the cold metal a familiar weight in his hands. The years of peace fell away, and the marshal returned, summoned by fire and violence. He didn't hesitate. The roar of the shotgun blast echoed through the valley, a declaration of war. One of the men screamed and fell. The other 2 returned fire bullets, splintering the trees around him. Elias dropped to the ground, reloading, as he moved the actions automatic, ingrained by years of practice. He was no longer just a man defending his home. He was a man defending the woman inside it. The thought was a revelation, a spark of light in the violent darkness. He had let Nora into his sanctuary, and now, despite her confession, he could not bear the thought of harm coming to her. Inside the cabin, Nora was paralyzed with fear. The gunshots, the shouts, the smell of burning wood, it was a nightmare. She stood in the center of the room, clutching the rifle Elias had given her, its weight an impossible burden. Shoot anything that tries to get through the door. His words echoed in her head. She heard a thud against the front door, then the scraping of metal against the lock. Someone was trying to get in. Panic seized her. She raised the rifle, her arms shaking so violently she could barely aim. The lock splintered. The door swung inward, revealing the silhouette of a large man against the moonlit yard. Nora screamed and pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the recoil sending her stumbling backward. The man in the doorway grunted and fell. For a moment, there was only the ringing in her ears. Then, a terrible thought pierced her panic. What if it was Elias? She scrambled to the doorway, her heart seizing with terror. The man lay face down on the porch. It wasn't Elias. It was one of Sterling's men, a large bearded man she recognized from the livery stable in town. A dark stain was spreading across his back. She had shot him. She had taken a life. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, and she staggered back, gasping for air. The fight outside was over as quickly as it had begun. The remaining attackers, having lost the element of surprise, and 2 of their men fled into the night. Elias appeared in the doorway moments later, his face grim, a thin line of blood trickling from a graze on his temple. His eyes found the body on the porch, then moved to Nora, who was huddled against the wall, the rifle lying on the floor beside her. He saw her pale face, her wide, horrified eyes. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She shook her head, unable to speak. She pointed a trembling finger toward the dead man. Elias followed her gaze. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You did what you had to do," he said softly. "You survived." He helped her to a chair and then dealt with the grim task of dragging the body off the porch. When he returned, he found her staring into the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, as if to ward off a chill that came from within. "He would have killed us both," Elias said, his voice losing its hard edge. He sat in the chair opposite her, the firelight playing across the exhaustion and sorrow etched on his face. "I know," she whispered, "but that doesn't change what I did." They sat in silence for a long time, the fire crackling in the hearth, the aftermath of the night's violence settling around them. The barrier of betrayal had been burned away, in the firefight replaced by a raw, undeniable connection. They had fought for this place, for each other. "Sterling won't stop," Elias said, finally, his voice heavy. This was just the beginning. He'll send the sheriff next with a warrant based on some trumped-up charge. He'll use the law to finish what his thugs couldn't. Then we have to fight him with the law. Nora said, a new resolve, hardening her voice. The shock was receding, replaced by a cold anger. There has to be a way. A record of the land sale, something to prove your deed is legal. Elias shook his head. The original county records were destroyed in a fire 10 years ago. All that's left is the copy of the deed I hold and the one in the land office. Sterling's a judge. It would be my word against his. Nora's mind, trained in logic and research, began to churn. There must be something. A witness to the original sale. A bank record. Something he overlooked. She looked at Elias, her eyes pleading. You can't just let him take this from you. He has already taken everything that mattered from me once before. Elias said, his voice so low she could barely hear it. He looked into the flames, his gaze distant, lost in a past she was only beginning to understand. I won't let him do it again. It was then that Nora realized the truth. Judge Sterling wasn't just after the land. This was personal. The attacks, the threats, the relentless pressure, it was a vendetta. But why? What had Elias ever done to warrant such a cold, calculated campaign of destruction? Her eyes fell on the medical books on the shelf on the locked box she had opened. A doctor, a marshal, a grieving husband. The pieces were there, but she couldn't see how they fit together. Elias, she said softly, who is Elizabeth? The question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. He flinched as if she had struck him. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. When he finally spoke, his back was still to her, his voice choked with a grief that was 5 years old, but still raw. She was my wife, he said. And Judge Sterling, he was her father. The revelation struck Nora with the force of a lightning bolt. Suddenly, the fragmented pieces of the puzzle slammed into place, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. Sterling wasn't just a greedy land baron. He was a father seeking revenge. He blames you for her death, Nora whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Elias turned from the window, his face a mask of anguish. She died in childbirth. The baby too. Our son. I was the doctor attending her. There were complications. I did everything I could, but I couldn't save them. His voice broke. Sterling was never the same. He said I killed her, that my incompetence took his only child from him. He swore he would see me destroyed, that he would take everything I ever loved, just as I had taken everything from him. Nora stared at him, her heart aching with the weight of his tragedy. This wasn't a fight over land or silver. This was a war born from grief and blame, a father's twisted crusade against the man he held responsible for his daughter's death. He sent me here to finish it. She said, the full horror of her initial mission dawning on her. He sent me to be the final instrument of his revenge. In that moment, Nora knew what she had to do. She had been Sterling's pawn. Now she would be his undoing. She would not let this good, broken man be consumed by a grief-fueled vendetta. She would find the truth, no matter the cost. As Elias predicted, Sheriff Brody arrived 2 days later, a posse of grim-faced deputies at his back. He carried a warrant for Elias's arrest. The charge was cattle rustling. Several ranchers on the far side of the county, all of them in debt to Judge Sterling's bank, had signed affidavits claiming they'd seen Elias driving their cattle toward his ranch. It was a lie, transparent and malicious, but it was a legal document signed by a judge. Elias. I don't have a choice. Brody said, his expression a mixture of duty and regret. He was a decent man, caught in an impossible situation. The warrant is legal. You have to come with me and leave my ranch and Miss Hastings to the mercy of Sterling's men. Elias's voice was dangerously calm. I don't think so. Don't make this harder than it has to be, the sheriff pleaded. Elias stood on the porch of his cabin, the shotgun held loosely in his hands. He was a fugitive on his own land. You tell the judge that if he wants me, he can come and get me himself. Sheriff Brody sighed, the weight of the inevitable settling on his shoulders. I'll give you 24 hours to turn yourself in, Vance. After that, I'm coming back, and I won't be coming alone. As the posse rode away, Nora turned to Elias, her mind racing. This is his plan. He'll have you locked up, and his men will take the ranch. We can't let that happen. We don't have a choice. Elias said, his voice heavy with resignation. The law is on his side. Then we have to find a truth the law can't ignore. Nora insisted. Elias, you have to tell me everything about the night Elizabeth died. Every detail. There has to be something Sterling has overlooked. That night, as a storm gathered over the mountains, Elias finally spoke of the past he had kept buried for 5 years. He told her about Elizabeth, about their life together, about their excitement for their first child. And he told her about the night she went into labor. It was a difficult birth from the start, he said, his voice a low-pained whisper. The baby was positioned wrong. I knew I needed help. He had sent for Dr. Morrison, the town doctor, an older, respected physician. Morrison arrived, but he seemed flustered. He'd been drinking. He argued with my diagnosis, insisted on a course of action that I knew was wrong. But he was the senior physician. I deferred to his judgment. Elias's voice was thick with self-loathing. It was a mistake. Elizabeth started bleeding. By the time Morrison realized I had been right, it was too late. We lost them both. So it was Morrison's fault, Nora said, seizing on the detail. It was my failure, Elias corrected her harshly. I was her husband. I was a doctor. I should have overruled him, thrown him out of the room. But I followed protocol, and my wife and son paid the price. In the aftermath, a grieving and enraged Judge Sterling had destroyed Elias's reputation. He accused Elias of incompetence and malpractice. Dr. Morrison, to save his own career, had corroborated the judge's story, testifying that Elias had panicked and made a series of fatal errors. Elias, broken by grief and guilt, had not fought the accusations. He had simply walked away from his life, from his career, from everything, and disappeared into the mountains. There's no proof, Elias concluded, the hope dying in his eyes. It's my word against a respected doctor and a powerful judge. But Nora's mind was already working. Dr. Morrison. He's the key. Why would he risk his reputation to cover for you if you were truly incompetent? It makes no sense. Unless... A terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. Unless he had a reason to ensure Elizabeth died. The idea was monstrous, but it fit the cold, calculating cruelty of Judge Sterling. He was bribed, Nora whispered. Sterling paid him, not to save her, but to make sure she didn't survive. To frame you for her death and give Sterling his reason for revenge. Elias stared at her, the color draining from his face, as the horrifying logic of her theory sank in. It explained everything: Morrison's strange behavior, his willingness to lie, Sterling's absolute certainty of Elias's guilt. We have to prove it, Nora said, her voice filled with a new fierce urgency. We need Morrison's testimony. The next morning, under a sky the color of bruised plums, Nora rode for redemption. She left Elias at the ranch, a lone man preparing for his final stand. It was a desperate gamble. She had to reach Dr. Morrison, to confront him with her theory, and pray that he had a sliver of conscience left. The town felt different, hostile. Eyes followed her as she rode down the main street. The story of the fugitive rancher had spread. She was the woman harboring a criminal. She found Dr. Morrison in his surgery, a small, cluttered room that smelled of antiseptic and decay. He was an old man, his hands afflicted with a tremor he tried to hide by keeping them shoved in his pockets. Miss Hastings, he said, his voice thin and reedy. I can't help you. I think you can. Nora said, closing the door behind her. I know what happened the night Elizabeth Sterling died, and I know you lied. The old doctor paled. I don't know what you're talking about. Judge Sterling paid you, didn't he? Nora pressed her voice low and intense. He paid you to let his own daughter die, just so he could have his revenge on Elias Vance. Morrison collapsed into a chair, his face ashen. He said it was a test, the old man whispered, his voice cracking. He said Vance was arrogant, that he thought he knew everything. Sterling wanted to see him humbled. He offered me money enough to retire to pay off my debts. He said just to let Vance handle it, to let him fail on his own. But it went wrong. So wrong. I never thought. I never thought she would die." Tears streamed down the old man's face. "I've lived with it every day for 5 years," he sobbed. "The guilt has eaten me alive. Then it's time to tell the truth." Nora said, her voice softening with a sliver of pity for the pathetic broken man before her. "Write it down. Everything. Sign it. It's the only way to make this right." As Morrison frantically scribbled his confession, the first clap of thunder rattled the windows. The storm had arrived. And with it, Nora knew the final confrontation at Pine Creek Ranch was about to begin. She took the signed confession, a flimsy piece of paper that held the power to save one man and destroy another, and raced out of the surgery. She had to get back to Elias before it was too late. The sky broke open as Nora galloped out of town. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the dusty trail to a river of mud. The wind rose to a furious howl, tearing at the trees, a physical manifestation of the violence about to be unleashed. The sandstorm that followed the rain was a biblical plague, a roiling wall of red dust that blotted out the sun and scoured the landscape. Visibility dropped to near zero. It was a storm of biblical proportions, a fitting backdrop for the final act of Judge Sterling's tragedy. Elias watched the storm roll in from the barn. He had moved his few remaining cattle inside, barricaded the cabin, and was now preparing for a war he did not want but could not avoid. The howling wind was a mournful symphony, a lament for the peace he had lost. He saw them through the swirling dust, a dozen riders emerging from the storm like wraiths. At the head of the posse were Sheriff Brody and Judge Sterling himself, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He had come to witness the end of Elias Vance. "It's over." Vance Brody's voice was torn away by the wind. "Come out with your hands up." Elias stepped out of the barn, the shotgun held at his side. He would not cower. He would face his accuser on his own terms. "This is between me and him." Brody Elias shouted back, nodding toward the judge. "Let your men go." Sterling urged his horse forward, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. "You will pay for what you did, Vance. You will pay for my daughter's life." "She didn't have to die, Sterling," Elias roared, his own grief and rage finally breaking free. "Your pride killed her. Your need to see me fail." At that moment, Nora burst through the maelstrom. Her horse, lathered and wild-eyed, slid to a halt in the muddy yard. She was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face. But in her hand, she clutched a piece of paper protected from the rain, inside an oilcloth pouch. "It's over, Judge," she screamed, her voice raw. "I have a confession from Dr. Morrison. He told me everything." Sterling's face went slack with shock. He stared at Nora, then at the paper in her hand, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. His hired guns, seeing their master's composure crack, grew nervous. One of them, Jed, raised his rifle. "She's lying," he shouted. "Kill them both." The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire and howling wind. Sheriff Brody, a man of the law to his core, yelled for his deputies to hold their fire. But it was too late. Sterling's men opened up their bullets, kicking up mud around Elias and Nora. Elias shoved Nora toward the cover of the barn, firing the shotgun over her head to scatter the attackers. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a bullet grazed him. He stumbled but kept moving, pulling Nora into the relative safety of the barn, just as a bullet shattered the spot where she had been standing. The barn became their fortress. Dust and rain swirled through the broken slats, the wind shrieking like a banshee. Outside, a chaotic gunfight raged between the sheriff's men, who were trying to restore order, and Sterling's hired guns, who were trying to eliminate all witnesses. Elias, bleeding and cornered, knew this was the end. He had to protect Nora. He shoved his Colt, the one he had taken from a fallen gunman, into her hand. "Get to the back. There's a loose board behind the hayloft. You can slip out into the trees. I'm not leaving you." Nora cried, her face fierce with a loyalty that humbled him. Suddenly, the main barn door crashed open. Judge Sterling stood there, a revolver in his hand, his fine coat spattered with mud, his face a rictus of madness. "You will not take anything more from me," he shrieked, his voice cracking with insane grief. He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at Nora. In that split second, Elias had a choice. He could shoot Sterling, kill the man who had tormented him, the man who had orchestrated his wife's death. Vengeance was his, for the taking. But as he looked at the deranged, grief-stricken man in the doorway, he didn't see a monster. He saw a father broken by loss just as he himself had been. He saw the end of a cycle of hatred that had already consumed too many lives. He leveled his own gun not at Sterling's heart, but at his hand. He fired. The judge's pistol flew from his grasp. At the same time, Sheriff Brody appeared behind Sterling, tackling him to the ground. "It's done, Judge," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "It's all done." Elias lowered his gun. He looked at Nora, who was staring at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He had chosen justice over vengeance. He had chosen the man he wanted to be, not the man his grief had made him. He had chosen life. As the last of the wind died down, an unnerving quiet fell over Pine Creek Ranch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and broken. The sky was a bruised purple, the air cool and damp. Wounded men were being tended to by the sheriff's deputies. The survivors of Sterling's private army were in custody, their fight gone. Judge Sterling, a man stripped of his power and his sanity, sat slumped in the back of a wagon, his gaze vacant, lost in a world of his own making. Nora gently cleaned the wound on Elias's shoulder. The bullet had torn through the flesh, but missed the bone. It was a clean wound, a painful but fitting scar from the battle he had won. "He'll be sent to the Territorial Asylum," Sheriff Brody said, walking over to them. He held Dr. Morrison's confession in his hand. "This changes everything. Your name is cleared, Elias. The ranch is yours, free and clear." He looked from Elias to Nora, a flicker of a smile on his tired face. "You two make quite a team." After the sheriff and his men departed, taking the prisoners with them, a profound silence descended. Elias and Nora stood in the muddy yard, surrounded by the wreckage of the fight, the splintered wood of the barn and the burned-out shell of the chicken coop, the churned-up earth. It was a scene of devastation. But for the first time in 5 years, Elias felt a sense of peace. He walked over to Nora and gently took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a small warm anchor in the quiet aftermath. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You saved me, Nora. In more ways than one, we saved each other," she replied softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Over the next few weeks, the town of Redemption rallied around them. The story of Judge Sterling's madness and Elias Vance's vindication had spread like wildfire. People who had once shunned him now came to the ranch offering help. Old Man Abernathy from the general store organized a crew to rebuild the barn. The ranchers who had signed the false affidavits came hats in hand to offer their apologies and their labor. Pine Creek Ranch, once a symbol of Elias's isolation, was becoming the heart of a community. Elias and Nora worked side by side, rebuilding not just the ranch, but their lives. The quiet companionship they had shared before blossomed into something deeper, a love forged in adversity and sealed in loyalty. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they no longer held the same power. The silence in the cabin was now filled with easy conversation, with shared meals, with the quiet comfort of two people who had found their home in each other. Months later, when the aspens in the high valley had turned to gold and the air held the crisp promise of autumn, Elias took Nora by the hand and led her to the secluded grove behind the cabin. The afternoon sun filtered through the yellow leaves, dappling the ground with light. He stopped before the simple wooden cross that marked Elizabeth's grave. He had not been back here since the storm. He knelt and gently cleared a few stray leaves from the base of the cross. Nora stood silently beside him, giving him the space he needed for this final act of letting go. From his pocket, Elias took a small tarnished silver locket Elizabeth's. He held it in his palm for a long moment, then placed it carefully on the headstone. It was not an act of forgetting, but of acceptance, a tribute to the love that had been, and a release from the guilt that had imprisoned him for so long. He was finally forgiving himself. He rose and turned to Nora, his eyes clear and free of the shadows that had haunted them for so long. He took her in his arms, holding her close. "It's time for a new beginning," he whispered. They stood together, looking out over Pine Creek Ranch. The new barn stood proud and strong against the sky. The cattle grazed peacefully in the meadow. The cabin, their home, was a warm, welcoming light in the valley. It was a testament to their resilience, a symbol of the life they had built from the ashes of their pasts. Nora turned in his arms, her hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a radiant, hopeful light that took his breath away. "I think," she said, her voice soft with wonder, "our new beginning has already started." Elias looked from her glowing face to the hand resting on her abdomen, and understanding dawned. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded expression of pure joy. He placed his hand over hers, a new life stirring beneath their touch, a promise of a future he had never dared to dream of. Their shared look of hope and love signaled the true start of their new life, a life of healing, of family, and of a love powerful enough to redeem even the most broken of souls.